Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of this gripping story. The Bellanova diner had been open for 42 years, and in all that time, it had never closed early. Not for storms, not for riots, and not even for the quiet wars that sometimes passed through the city like invisible smoke. Tonight was no different. Neon lights buzzed softly in the windows, rain streaked down the glass, and the smell of coffee and grilled onions hung heavy in the air. To anyone watching from outside, it looked like an ordinary place. But nothing was ordinary about the man sitting alone in the back booth. Victor Moretti didn't choose corners by accident. He chose them because corners revealed everything: who entered, who hesitated, who pretended not to look. His dark suit was perfectly pressed, his silver hair neatly combed, and his face calm in the way only powerful men could manage. He didn't need to raise his voice or flash a weapon. The city already knew his name. And those who didn't usually didn't live long enough to learn it. Across the diner, his bodyguard, Frank Russo, stood near the counter pretending to scroll through his phone. Frank had been with Victor for 12 years. 12 years of loyalty, silence, and survival. He knew Victor's routines, his habits, even how he liked his coffee: black, no sugar, always refilled before the cup went cold. Trust like that wasn't given easily in Victor's world. It was earned, tested, and paid for in blood and money. The waitress approached the booth slowly, holding a coffee pot in one hand and a small notepad in the other. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, with tired eyes and hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her name tag read Lena. Victor noticed her hands first. They weren't shaking. That alone was unusual. Most people's hands trembled when they got close to him, even if they didn't know why. "Refill?" she asked politely. Victor nodded without looking up. His attention was on the reflection in the window beside him. He watched the door, the rain, and Frank's shadow behind him. Lena poured the coffee carefully, then paused just a moment longer than necessary. It was subtle, almost nothing, but Victor noticed everything. She leaned in slightly, as if to place the pot down, and whispered just one line, so soft it barely disturbed the air. "Your bodyguard sold you out. You're the payment." She straightened immediately and walked away as if nothing had happened. For the first time in years, Victor Moretti didn't move. The words echoed in his head, not because they were loud, but because they were precise. Accusations were common. Threats were routine. But this wasn't either. This was information. Clean, sharp, final. Victor lifted his coffee cup slowly and took a sip, keeping his expression neutral. Around him, the diner continued as normal. A couple argued quietly near the window. A truck driver laughed at something on his phone. The cook shouted an order from the back. Life went on, unaware that something invisible had just shifted. Victor's eyes flicked to the reflection again. Frank stood exactly where he had been moments ago. Same posture, same casual stance. But Victor noticed something else now. Frank wasn't watching the door. He was watching Victor. Trust, Victor knew, didn't break loudly. It cracked silently. He set the cup down and placed a folded bill on the table, more than enough to cover the coffee. Then he stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the exit at an unhurried pace. As he passed the counter, Lena avoided his eyes. Not out of fear, but out of caution. Like someone who had already done what needed to be done. Outside, the rain hit harder. Victor stepped under the awning and breathed in slowly. He didn't get into the car. Instead, he turned left and began walking down the sidewalk, blending into the night. Behind him, after a few seconds, he heard footsteps. Controlled, familiar. "Frank." "Boss," Frank called out calmly. "You forgot the car." Victor stopped but didn't turn around. "I needed some air." Frank approached, stopping a few feet behind him. "Too far to grab, too close to ignore. You want me to call it around?" Frank asked. Victor smiled faintly. "No, I think I'll walk." For a moment, neither man spoke. The rain filled the silence. Then Victor said quietly, "How much?" Frank didn't answer right away. That hesitation told Victor everything. Frank exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when the truth has finally caught up to him. The rain darkened his jacket, and the streetlight above cast long shadows that stretched between him and Victor like a warning line neither could cross back over. "It wasn't personal," Frank said at last. His voice was steady, almost apologetic. "It never is." Victor turned around then, studying the man he had trusted for over a decade. Frank's face looked the same, hard, disciplined, loyal at first glance, but Victor now saw the cracks. Loyalty didn't avoid eye contact. Loyalty didn't hesitate. You picked the wrong excuse, Victor replied calmly. Personal or not, you made a decision. Frank nodded. They offered a clean exit. New name, new life. You know how rare that is. He glanced down the street, checking corners out of habit. And they didn't want you dead right away. Just removed. Victor almost laughed. Removed, he repeated. Is that what they told you? He stepped closer, close enough to lower his voice without fear. I built this city's silence. There's no removing me without noise. Frank's jaw tightened. That's why the waitress warned you. They didn't plan for that. Victor's eyes sharpened. You noticed her too. Frank nodded once. She wasn't supposed to speak. She was just meant to serve. That single sentence confirmed what Victor had already suspected. This wasn't a random betrayal. It was coordinated, planned, and somewhere in that plan, a young waitress had chosen to break the rules. Victor stepped back and looked up at the rain-soaked sky. Time, he realized, was now his enemy. Every second standing still was a second someone else was moving. Who's behind it? Victor asked. Frank hesitated again. You already know. Victor did. There were only a handful of people bold enough to buy a bodyguard and try to collect a man like Victor Moretti. Old partners, old rivals, men who smiled at the same table and counted knives under it. Caruso, Victor said quietly. Frank didn't deny it. Victor nodded slowly. He always hated owing favors. He glanced back toward the diner. Through the glass, he could see Lena wiping down a counter, her movements fast but controlled. She knew something more than she had said. And she had risked her life to say it. That mattered. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, not close, but not far either. Victor knew the city's rhythms. That sound wasn't random. It was pressure. You were supposed to deliver me, Victor said. Alive. Tonight, Frank replied. They wanted you isolated, scared, willing to disappear. Victor smiled faintly. And if I wasn't? Frank's eyes hardened. Then it would have gotten messy. Victor turned and walked back toward the diner without another word. Frank followed, confused. What are you doing? He asked. Correcting an imbalance, Victor said. Inside, the warmth hit them immediately. The smell of coffee felt heavier now, like it carried secrets. Conversations continued, unaware of how close danger sat among them. Victor walked straight to the counter. Lena froze when she saw him approach. You should clock out, Victor said quietly. Her eyes widened. I can't. You can, he interrupted. And you should. Now, she looked at Frank, then back at Victor. Something in Victor's expression told her this wasn't a suggestion. She nodded, untied her apron with shaking fingers, and slipped it under the counter. Without another word, she headed toward the back door. Frank stepped forward. That wasn't part of. Victor raised a hand. Neither was your betrayal. Frank stopped. Victor leaned against the counter casually, as if he were just another late-night customer. You sold me for a future, Victor said. But you forgot one thing. Frank frowned. What's that? I don't disappear, Victor replied. I adapt. Before Frank could respond, Victor's phone vibrated. He checked the screen and smiled. Too late, he said softly. Frank's eyes widened. What did you do? Victor slid the phone back into his pocket. I reminded a few people who they work for. Outside, engines roared to life. Not police. Victor knew the sound of his own men. Loyal ones. The kind who didn't ask questions when called at odd hours. Frank's hand twitched, but he didn't move. He knew better. Escape was no longer an option. Victor straightened his jacket. You were a good bodyguard, he said honestly. But you chose the wrong ending. Frank swallowed. Are they going to kill me? Victor shook his head. No, that would be too easy. The diner doors opened, and two men stepped inside, calm and quiet, blending in like customers. Victor nodded once. They understood. As Frank was escorted toward the exit, Victor turned back to the counter, ordered another coffee, and sat down in the same booth as before. The rain continued to fall. The city continued to breathe. And somewhere out there, Caruso was about to learn that deals made in whispers didn't always stay secret. Victor took a sip of his coffee and stared out the window, already planning his next move. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. Victor sat in the booth long after the coffee had gone cold, watching the reflections move across the diner's glass like ghosts passing through another world. Outside, his men had taken Frank away without a scene, without raised voices, without drama. That was how Victor preferred it. Noise attracted attention, and attention created problems. Tonight, he needed clarity more than control. Betrayal had a way of rearranging priorities, and Victor was already reorganizing his world in his head. He paid for the coffee again, more out of habit than necessity, and stepped outside. The rain had softened to a mist, clinging to his coat as he walked toward the waiting car. One of his men opened the door without speaking. Inside, the familiar scent of leather and polished wood wrapped around him like armor. As the car pulled away, Victor closed his eyes briefly and allowed himself one rare moment of reflection. 12 years of loyalty erased by a single decision. He didn't feel anger. Anger clouded judgment. What he felt was something far more dangerous: focus. Where to? The driver asked. Not home, Victor replied. Take me to the old office. The old office was a place even his enemies believed abandoned. A relic from before Victor's name carried weight, back when he had still needed walls to feel safe. Few people knew it still existed, and fewer still had access. As the car cut through side streets, Victor pulled out his phone and began sending messages. Not many, just enough. The kind of messages that didn't explain anything but demanded presence. Within minutes, confirmations came back. Loyal men, smart men, men who understood silence. When they arrived, Victor stepped into the dimly lit building and felt the past settle around him. Dusty furniture, old photographs, memories he didn't visit often. This place had seen his rise, his mistakes, and his first betrayals. It felt fitting that it would now witness another turning point. He loosened his tie and sat at the head of a long wooden table as the others filtered in, one by one. No greetings, no small talk. They didn't need it. Caruso has moved, Victor said finally. And he believes I'm already gone. A murmur passed through the room, controlled but sharp. Caruso wasn't just an enemy. He was history. Shared victories, shared blood, shared grudges. Victor continued. He bought my bodyguard. He arranged my collection. And he underestimated something. One of the men leaned forward. The waitress. Victor nodded. Her name is Lena, and she chose to warn me. Another man frowned. Why would she risk that? Victor allowed himself a small smile. Because not everyone sells their soul at the first offer. The room fell silent again. Loyalty, Victor knew, wasn't always found in uniforms or long service. Sometimes it appeared where you least expected it. He stood. Caruso thinks this ends quietly. That I disappear and the city forgets. That won't happen. Plans began to form. Not rushed, not emotional. Strategic. Victor listened more than he spoke, adjusting pieces in his mind like a chessboard he had played on his entire life. By the time the meeting ended, the path forward was clear. Caruso would be exposed before he could strike again. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, the way men like Caruso feared most. Hours later, Victor found himself back in his car, this time heading somewhere unexpected. The diner. It was nearly closing time when he walked in again. The place was emptier now, chairs stacked, lights dimmed. The manager looked up, startled, but Victor waved him off. I'm looking for Lena. The manager hesitated. She left early. Said she wasn't feeling well. Victor nodded. I know where she went. He did. One of his men had followed discreetly, not to threaten, but to ensure. She wasn't followed by someone else. Loyalty, after all, deserved protection. Victor arrived at a small apartment building on the edge of the neighborhood. He climbed the stairs alone and knocked once. Lena opened the door slowly, fear flashing across her face until she recognized him. I told you everything I knew, she said quickly. I'm not here for more, Victor replied. I'm here to say thank you. She blinked, clearly unprepared for that. He handed her an envelope. She didn't open it. I don't want trouble, she said. You already chose that path, Victor said gently. This is protection, and an opportunity. She studied him, then stepped aside to let him in. Her apartment was modest, clean, carefully kept. A life built on routine and caution. Victor respected that. Why me? She asked quietly. Because you saw something wrong and didn't ignore it, Victor replied. That makes you valuable. She swallowed. What happens now? Victor looked at her seriously. Now you disappear, but on your terms. When he left, the rain had stopped completely. The city felt different, not safer, just quieter. Victor returned to his car and gave one final instruction for the night. Begin Phase 1. Across the city, subtle shifts began. Meetings cancelled, alliances questioned, messages intercepted. Caruso felt it before he understood it, a tightening, like a room losing air. He sat in his penthouse, staring at his phone, waiting for confirmation that never came. Victor Moretti was supposed to be gone. Instead, Victor stood in the shadows, very much alive, watching the city realign itself around his return. And Caruso was running out of time. Caruso sensed it before any warning reached him. Power had a rhythm, and when it shifted, men like him felt it in their bones. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed without explanation. Longtime partners suddenly became careful with their words. In Caruso's world, hesitation was a symptom, and symptoms meant something was wrong. He stood by the window of his penthouse, overlooking the city he believed he was about to inherit, and felt a rare flicker of unease crawl up his spine. He checked his phone again. Still nothing from Frank. That bothered him more than anything else. Frank was efficient, predictable, professional. If Victor Moretti had truly been removed, Frank would have confirmed it. Silence meant failure, and failure meant exposure. Caruso poured himself a drink he didn't really want and replayed the plan in his head, searching for the crack he might have missed. Everything had been clean. The diner, the timing, the isolation. The waitress wasn't supposed to matter. She was a variable too small to calculate. Or so he had thought. Across town, Victor moved just as quietly, but with far more purpose. He hadn't slept. He didn't need to. Momentum kept him sharp. From a secure location, he watched information flow in, small details forming a clear picture. Caruso was nervous. Nervous men made mistakes. Victor didn't rush. He let the tension build, let the city whisper on his behalf. Fear traveled faster than orders ever could. By morning, rumors had reached every corner of the underworld. Victor Moretti was alive. Some said he had never been touched. Others claimed the attempt had backfired spectacularly. Victor let the stories spread unchecked. Truth was less important than belief, and belief was already doing his work for him. Caruso's allies began asking questions. Quiet ones at first, then louder ones. Nobody wanted to be tied to a man who failed to finish what he started. Victor paid a visit to an old friend that afternoon, a man who ran numbers and knew how to listen. They spoke over chess, moving pieces without urgency. Caruso's money is slowing, the man said casually. Banks don't trust him, neither do his partners. Victor nodded. He built his confidence on my absence. And now he understands he made a mistake. The game ended without a winner. Victor stood and straightened his coat. Outside, the city buzzed with ordinary life, people rushing to work, taxis honking, vendors shouting. None of them knew how close they were to a silent storm. Victor preferred it that way. Control wasn't about chaos, it was about direction. That evening, Caruso finally made a move. He reached out, not directly to Victor, but to someone Victor trusted. A request for a meeting. Neutral ground. No weapons. Just conversation. Victor smiled when he heard. Desperation always dressed itself as diplomacy. Tell him yes, Victor said. Tomorrow night. The location was an old theater, closed for renovations. Empty seats, a dusty stage, the echo of forgotten applause. It was the kind of place where history lingered. Victor arrived first, standing alone in the aisle, hands relaxed at his sides. He didn't bring many men. He didn't need to. Confidence was louder than an army. Caruso entered moments later, flanked by two guards who looked like they wished they were somewhere else. He looked older than Victor remembered. Not weaker, just worn. You should be dead, Caruso said without greeting. So should you, Victor replied calmly. They stood there, two men who had once trusted each other with everything, now measuring the distance between them like it was a weapon. Caruso forced a smile. There's been a misunderstanding. Victor tilted his head. You bought my bodyguard. You arranged my capture. Which part was unclear? Caruso's smile faded. You were in the way. Victor nodded. I usually am. They talked for a long time after that. Not about forgiveness. Not about peace. About territory, influence, and survival. Caruso offered concessions. Victor listened. He always listened. When the conversation ended, Caruso realized too late that he hadn't gained anything. He had only revealed how much he was willing to lose. As Caruso left the theater, Victor stayed behind, standing on the empty stage. The spotlight flickered on briefly, illuminating him in a pool of pale light. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel it, the weight of the city, the danger, the inevitability of what came next. Then the light went out. By the next morning, Caruso's empire began to fracture. Not violently, efficiently, accounts frozen, roots disrupted, allies stepping back. Every move Victor made was legal enough to avoid attention, but ruthless enough to be effective. Caruso watched it happen from behind locked doors, understanding now that Victor hadn't just survived. He had returned stronger. And somewhere far from the city, Lena boarded a bus under a new name, holding a future she hadn't planned but had earned. She didn't know how the war would end. She only knew she had changed its beginning. Victor stood at his window as dawn broke, watching the city wake up unaware of how close it had come to a different ruler. The waitress's whisper still echoed in his mind, not as a warning now, but as a reminder. In his world, survival belonged to those who listened. And Victor Moretti was listening very carefully. Caruso didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his penthouse, city lights glowing beneath him like a false sense of control. Every notification on his phone felt heavier than the last, each one carrying bad news disguised as updates. A partner in the south had paused operations. A shipping route had been delayed indefinitely. A bank requested documents it had never needed before. None of it was dramatic. That was the worst part. Victor Moretti wasn't attacking him with fire. He was suffocating him with air. Caruso finally understood the difference between fear and inevitability. Fear made men run. Inevitability made them freeze. Across the city, Victor moved through his day with calm precision. He met no one in person unless necessary. Orders traveled through trusted channels, layered and indirect. He wanted no single point of failure. Every instruction had a purpose, every silence a meaning. Victor knew Caruso was unraveling, but he also knew a cornered man could still be dangerous. That was why this phase required patience. Victor visited a small private bank late that afternoon, entering through a side door known only to a few. The manager greeted him with forced composure. "Mr. Moretti," he said, offering a seat. "We weren't expecting." "I know," Victor replied politely. "That's why I'm here." They spoke briefly. Victor didn't threaten. He didn't need to. He simply reminded the manager of certain past arrangements, certain protections that still stood. When Victor left, the manager's hands were shaking. By sunset, another of Caruso's accounts quietly vanished from his reach. Caruso finally broke the silence that evening. This time, he called Victor directly. "You're making a point," Caruso said, skipping greetings. "Yes," Victor replied. "And you're understanding it." Caruso's voice lowered. "What do you want?" Victor paused. He could hear the desperation now, stripped of pride. "I want you to stop pretending this was business," Victor said. "And admit it was a mistake." There was a long silence. Then Caruso exhaled. "Fine," he said. "It was a mistake." Victor closed his eyes briefly. The admission didn't satisfy him. It only confirmed what he already knew. "Mistakes have consequences," Victor said. "You taught me that." The call ended without resolution. Caruso stared at his phone long after the line went dead. He knew now that Victor wasn't negotiating. He was concluding. That same night, word reached Victor that Frank had asked to speak with him. The request surprised no one. Frank had been isolated, stripped of privilege but not dignity. Victor considered it for a moment, then agreed. They met in a quiet room with no windows. Frank looked thinner, older. "I won't ask for forgiveness," Frank said immediately. "I know better." Victor studied him. "Then why ask to see me?" "Because Caruso is planning something reckless," Frank replied. "And I don't want my name attached to it." Victor's expression didn't change. "You already chose your side." Frank nodded. "I know. But he's desperate now. And desperate men stop caring who gets hurt." Victor leaned back slightly. "What is he planning?" Frank hesitated. "A public move. Something loud enough to force you out." Victor's eyes narrowed. "He wants attention." "Yes," Frank said. "He thinks chaos is his last leverage." Victor stood. "Thank you for confirming what I suspected." Frank looked up. "Is that all?" Victor paused at the door. "You were loyal once," he said. "That's why you're still breathing." Frank lowered his head. He knew that was the closest thing to mercy he would ever receive. Victor left and immediately issued counterorders. If Caruso wanted noise, Victor would give him silence. He tightened security around public spaces, redirected influence away from crowded areas, and quietly evacuated people who mattered. The city would never know how close it came to panic. That was Victor's gift, and his warning. Caruso made his move 2 days later. A bold one. A declaration meant to remind everyone he still had power. But when the moment came, nothing happened the way he planned. His allies hesitated. His resources stalled. The message fell flat, echoing into nothing. Instead of fear, it created doubt. Doubt was poison. By nightfall, Caruso was alone. Victor watched the fallout from a distance, hands folded, expression unreadable. This wasn't revenge. It was balance being restored. He thought briefly of Lena, already far away, unaware of how much her single whisper had changed. One honest act had shifted an entire structure. That amused him. A final message arrived just before midnight. Caruso wanted to meet again. One last time. Victor didn't respond immediately. He poured himself a drink and stood by the window, watching the city breathe. He knew how this would end. He always had. Survival wasn't about strength. It was about timing. After a long moment, Victor typed a single word and sent it. Tomorrow. Somewhere across the city, Caruso read the message and felt the weight of it settle into his chest. He had gambled everything and lost. Tomorrow wasn't a meeting. It was an ending. And Victor Moretti was already there, waiting. Morning arrived without ceremony. The city woke as it always did, unaware that something decisive was approaching its conclusion. Victor Moretti watched the sunrise from behind thick glass, the pale light washing over buildings that had risen and fallen under his influence. He hadn't slept much, but he felt clear. This was the part of the game he understood best, the end, when masks slipped and truth had nowhere left to hide. Caruso chose the location this time, a private marina just outside the city. Quiet, controlled, symbolic. Boats rocked gently against their moorings, engines humming softly in the distance. Victor arrived exactly on time, stepping onto the dock with measured confidence. He brought only 2 men, both positioned far enough away to appear uninvolved. This wasn't a confrontation that needed witnesses. It needed understanding. Caruso was already there, leaning against the railing, staring out at the water. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but emotionally. The certainty that had once defined him was gone, replaced by calculation and regret. You always hated the water, Caruso said without turning. I hate unpredictability, Victor replied. The water just reminds me of it. Caruso nodded slowly. I thought removing you would simplify things. Victor stepped beside him, matching his gaze toward the horizon. That's the mistake everyone makes, he said. They think I'm the complication. Silence settled between them, heavy but controlled. Caruso finally turned. I won't insult you by pretending I can fix this, he said. I just want to know how it ends. Victor studied him carefully. It ends quietly, he said. If you let it. Caruso laughed softly. Quietly, he repeated. After everything. Yes, Victor said. Because noise only benefits those who don't understand consequence. Caruso exhaled and rested both hands on the railing. I built something, he said. I don't want it erased. Victor nodded. Neither did I. Once. They spoke for a long time after that, not as enemies, but as men who had reached the same cliff from different paths. Caruso admitted what pride had kept hidden. Fear of being overshadowed. Fear of becoming irrelevant. Fear of Victor's shadow stretching too far into his future. Victor listened, not because he needed the explanation, but because endings deserved to be heard. When the conversation ended, Caruso understood his position. He would step away, leave the city, dissolve his remaining operations quietly. In return, Victor would ensure the past stayed buried. No public reckoning, no spectacle, just absence. Caruso nodded once. I can live with that. Victor turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, he said. Caruso looked up. The waitress, Victor continued. Her life continues untouched. Caruso swallowed. Of course. Victor walked away without looking back. By the time he reached his car, Caruso was already on his phone, making arrangements, dismantling what remained of his empire with trembling hands. It was over. The following weeks passed like a slow exhale. The city adjusted. Power redistributed itself naturally, flowing back into familiar channels. Victor resumed appearances, meetings, routines. To the outside world, nothing had changed. That was the greatest victory of all. One afternoon, Victor received a postcard. No return address. Just a short message. I'm safe. Thank you for listening. Victor smiled and placed it in his desk drawer without another thought. Some debts didn't require acknowledgement. They required respect. Frank was transferred quietly, sent far from the city to live out a restrained existence under watchful eyes. He never contacted Victor again. He didn't need to. Their story had ended where it belonged. As weeks turned into months, Victor found himself thinking less about the betrayal and more about the moment before it, the whisper. One line had altered everything. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. Victor understood then that power wasn't just about control. It was about awareness. About listening when the world spoke softly. One evening, back at the Billionaire diner, Victor sat in the same booth where it had all begun. The neon lights buzzed, the coffee tasted the same, and the city outside moved on as if nothing had ever happened. He paid his bill, left a generous tip, and stood to leave. At the door, he paused and glanced back one last time. The booth was empty now. Ordinary, unremarkable. Victor stepped into the night, coat pulled tight, expression calm. He wasn't untouchable. He never had been. But he had survived something far more dangerous than enemies. He had survived certainty. And that was why he was still standing, while others had quietly faded away. The story wasn't about power anymore. It was about listening. And Victor Moretti had learned that lesson well. Time changed the city in ways no one could fully control. Buildings rose, streets were renamed, and new faces appeared in places once ruled by familiar ones. Yet beneath the surface, the same currents moved, guided by memory and influence. Victor Moretti understood that survival didn't end with victory. It required maintenance. Power left unattended invited challenge, and Victor had no intention of becoming a legend spoken about in the past tense. Months after Caruso's departure, Victor felt the shift again, not as sharp as before, but present. It came through small inconsistencies. A delay here, a rumor there, nothing alarming on its own, but together they formed a pattern. Someone was testing boundaries, quietly, carefully. Victor welcomed it. Tests revealed intentions. He called a private meeting at a location few knew existed, a renovated warehouse converted into a cultural foundation on paper. Art on the walls, music playing softly. A place that looked harmless enough to be ignored. Victor sat among trusted advisors, listening more than speaking. New names surfaced. Younger players. People who hadn't lived through the earlier wars and believed caution was weakness. They think you've softened, one man said. Victor smiled faintly. That's convenient. The challenge came not through violence, but narrative. Stories began circulating, questioning Victor's relevance. His age. His methods. Subtle doubts planted like seeds. Victor recognized the tactic. Undermine perception, and structure followed. He didn't rush to counter it. He let it grow just enough to reveal who was watering it. Meanwhile, Victor made an unexpected move. He funded community projects openly, schools, clinics, cultural spaces. Not for appearances alone, but for influence that couldn't be erased easily. Power rooted in people lasted longer than power built on fear. Critics dismissed it as optics. Victor allowed them to. He wasn't interested in convincing everyone. Only the ones who mattered. One evening, while reviewing reports, Victor noticed a familiar name buried in the details. Lena's new identity had crossed his system, not as a threat, but as an opportunity. She was thriving, working, anonymous. He smiled and closed the file. Some victories were meant to remain untouched. The pressure increased as a younger syndicate made a move, small but symbolic. Victor responded with silence. Days passed, then weeks. The lack of response unsettled them. Silence, Victor knew, forced imagination to do dangerous things. Eventually, their leader requested a meeting. Victor agreed. They met in daylight, in a public space, surrounded by normal life. The younger man was confident, rehearsed, eager to impress. He spoke of change, of evolution, of a city that needed new leadership. Victor listened patiently, nodding occasionally. When the man finished, Victor leaned forward slightly. "You've confused attention with authority," he said calmly. The man bristled. "With respect, times have changed." "Yes," Victor agreed. "They always do. That's why I'm still here." He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. No threats, no ultimatums, just certainty. Within days, the younger syndicate collapsed, not from outside pressure, but internal doubt. Leaders defected, support vanished. The story they had tried to write no longer made sense. Victor returned to his routine, but something inside him had shifted. He thought often of legacy, not in terms of monuments, but systems. He began delegating more, mentoring selectively, preparing for a future that didn't depend entirely on his presence. Survival, after all, wasn't just personal. One night, Victor found himself walking past the old theater again. Renovations were underway now, lights on, workers laughing, life reclaiming a space once filled with tension. He paused and watched for a while, feeling a rare sense of closure. Later that week, Victor received a message from an unknown number. Just one sentence. "They're asking questions about the diner." Victor's expression hardened slightly. Not fear, focus. The past had a way of resurfacing when least expected. He replied with a single instruction and put the phone away. Whatever was coming next, he would handle it the same way he always had, by listening first. The city moved on, unaware of how often its fate had been redirected by whispers rather than screams. Victor understood now that his greatest weapon wasn't influence or fear. It was restraint, and restraint, used correctly, lasted longer than any empire. As night settled in, Victor stood by his window once more, watching lights flicker across the skyline. The game wasn't ending. It never did, but it was evolving, and Victor Moretti was ready. Because in a world built on noise, the quiet ones survived the longest. The questions about the diner didn't stop. They multiplied. Victor felt them circling like distant thunder, unavoidable, but not yet dangerous. Someone had started pulling on a loose thread, curious about the night everything changed. Victor understood the risk. The Bellanova diner was ordinary, which made it powerful. Ordinary places hid extraordinary truths, and truths had a habit of resurfacing when people went looking for meaning. Victor didn't panic. Panic belonged to men who reacted instead of planned. He returned to the diner one quiet afternoon, alone this time, dressed like any other customer. The neon sign still buzzed, the counter still carried faint scratches from decades of elbows and spilled coffee. Time had passed, but not enough to erase memory. He sat in the booth again, not because he was sentimental, but because perspective mattered. From here, he could see the door, the counter, the reflections in the glass. He remembered the whisper clearly, not the words, but the decision behind them. Someone had chosen truth over safety. That choice had saved him. But it had also exposed a weakness in his world. Victor ordered coffee. The new waitress didn't recognize him. That was good. Anonymity was a form of protection. Elsewhere in the city, the people asking questions were discovering something frustrating. There was no evidence, no recordings, no witnesses willing to speak. Frank was gone. Caruso was gone. Lena was a ghost. What remained were assumptions, theories, and empty space. Victor had made sure of that. He had learned long ago that erasing facts was harder than erasing context. Still, Victor knew curiosity could become persistence. And persistence could become pressure. That night, Victor made a final adjustment. He shifted control away from himself just enough to disappear into the structure he had built. He promoted quietly, delegated invisibly. Names changed, roles blurred. The system no longer pointed to him, it flowed through him. If someone came looking for a single figure to blame, they would find nothing solid to hold. The questions faded after that. Not because they were answered, but because there was nothing left to chase. Weeks later, Victor stood at a small airport, watching a plane lift into the sky. Not for business, not for strategy, just observation. He thought of Lena somewhere far away, living a life untouched by whispers and shadows. He thought of Caruso, adjusting to a quieter existence. He even thought of Frank, learning what it meant to live without choice. Victor didn't regret the past. Regret wasted energy. What he felt instead was clarity. Power, he realized, was temporary. Awareness was permanent. He returned to the city with no announcement. No celebration. Just presence. The city accepted him the way it always had. Not loudly, but completely. Meetings resumed. Decisions were made. Life continued. Victor walked through it all like a man who no longer needed to prove anything. One evening, as rain fell softly over the streets, Victor passed the diner one last time. The lights were on. People were inside, laughing, arguing, living. He didn't go in. He didn't need to. The place had already given him what it needed to give. He walked on. The whisper that had once warned him no longer echoed as danger. It echoed as understanding. In a world built on power plays and loud threats, survival belonged to those who listened, to people, to silence, to moments others ignored. Victor Moretti had once believed strength was about control. Now he knew better. Strength was about knowing when you were already dead, and choosing to live differently because of it. And somewhere in the city, unnoticed and unchanged, the Bellanova diner stayed open late into the night, serving coffee, keeping secrets, and waiting for the next whisper that might change everything again.